Good evening, friends. Welcome back to the next virtual coaching class organized by Board of Studies ICA. Myself, Praveen Kumar Gilla. So I'm going to take up this evening paper 8 Indirect Tax Laws. Topic for today's discussion is offences and penalties. So friends, you are having a marathon with indirect taxation classes. I believe back to back you have been now attending auditing and indirect taxation sessions. So it's a challenge for us to cope up with the learning. There is no alternative mantra for this. So especially examination days, whatever 8 to 15 hours plan is there, we have to go with that. So with that backdrop, now today's topic for our discussion is offences and penalties. So friends, before we start our discussion, along with this material, there is one Excel file working note which is also uploaded on the portal. So I recommend all of you to have that Excel file in handy as we discuss through this particular session. Reason, the value out of learning in today's session will happen when we go through those Excel working note. So friends, what we have in today's session, like offences and penalties. Don't look this particular paper as a theory paper. I would put it in different fashion. When we watch a movie, at times it so happens that end of the movie, if I see last 2 to 3 minutes of the movie, I could recap and understand what all thing went on right from minute 1 till minute n-2. So likewise, this chapter called Offence and Penalty is as good as a recap of all those provisions what we have read till now. Basics of our taxation, registration chapter, levy and payment of taxes, exemptions under GST, compliance with e-way bill, filing of returns, availment of input tax credit. So friends, these are all the topics which is going to have a recap in this particular chapter called Offences and Penalties. So today what we are going to do, we are going to have a basic understanding of this term called offences and corresponding penal provisions. What do you mean by offence? When offence is to be established, what penal actions can the GST officer can do? Now especially I would say this one chapter, when you read thoroughly, post to qualification, once you get into the practice, this is going to be the scope of your core concentric practice of indirect taxation. Reason, we say prevention is better than cure. So when you learn thoroughly what are the expected compliances under any law, and if you take care of those compliances, you are going to take away the exposure of the assessee with respect to non-compliance of any tax law. So with that backdrop, friends, this particular chapter, I will give utmost attention and practical examples to keep you engaged and learn this chapter rather than theoretically. Application of this chapter, how practically it gives a value addition to our profession. So starting with, we'll understand what are the nature of offences which are listed down under the GST law and what corresponding penal actions are there. So like example, when we were asked to do a homework, and if we don't do homework in the classroom session, we'll have some sort of punishment. Similar to fashion, we'll have a couple of punishments called penal provisions under the GST law. We'll have a look of those aspects. Penal provisions, we will see what penal provisions are specifically explained, what penal provisions are generally explained. So given any business transaction, whether the penal provisions are straightly covered that particular transaction, if there is no scope, if there is no clarity with respect to this particular transaction, is there a general provision in relation to that particular non-compliance or offence, we'll have a understanding. So we will, when we walk through the session, we will understand whether these penal provisions are specific in nature or general in nature. Also, one point I would like to add here, when we talk about a violation, when we talk about a penalty, can this be applied only to person registered under the GST law, or can there be a scope beyond a registered person under the GST law? So this is one interesting factor. Every chapter when we walk through, every chapter when we discuss through, I would recommend all of you to give attention to this particular arena where we will understand whether these provisions are in general only to registered person, specific to a registered person or in general to a person other than registered person. I'll take examples so that you can get convenience with this discussion. Then general disciplines related to penalty. When an officer has to levy a penal provision, what are the disciplines which are governed under the GST law? What are the modalities involved? We will also have a walkthrough of that to understand. Vested powers to impose or waive off penalty. Now, all along we were talking, whenever there is an offense, there is a penal action to be taken. Now, can there be a scenario where there is a overlooking of my offense? Can there be a condonation of an offense? When I say condonation, this is a technical term. Write in your working notes the term called condonation. Condonation, where there is a plea or where there is a ignorance, when there is a relaxation given by a law or an officer consent in relation to a particular violation. So we will see this particular vested powers of the officer and when he can waive off that particular penalty. Also, friends, important one aspect is, see, I was talking about a term called prevention is better than cure. Now, when you know that this particular exposure is there under the law, better to avoid that particular exposure. How? You will try to make a background of the case where you will see whether all the provisions which are there in the GST law have been properly explained and understood, presented before the officer, where exposure of penalty has been omitted. I'll give an example here. When I have registered under the GST law, I'll give an example of a, say, association of persons in a big apartment. When there is a apartment where there is a welfare association, so assuming there are 100 apartments, each apartment pays some amount called maintenance amount, say sum of rupees 5,000 per month to this unregistered association. I don't know whether that particular activity is covered under the GST law, whether I'm supposed to pay tax on that. In absence of a clarity, in ignorance of a law, what I will do, I'll approach the officer concerned, I'll write a letter. So-and-so officer, please understand that we are working and operating under so-and-so style and function. We don't know whether we have to comply with the GST law. Kindly let us know what needs to be done. So this is one particular letter. If I have written to the officer, it is more like a prevention of your non-compliance with the law. Assuming for a moment there is application of payment of GST, by making yourself opened up, by making your transactions communicated to the officer concerned, you are trying to minimize, reduce the risk of penal provisions. Reason being, when we talk about penalty, it's a costly affair for a business function to deal with. So when we go through the further slides, you'll understand why is that so important. We need to give much more importance to this particular penalty provisions and how we can get out of penalty provisions. Next term, confiscation. We will understand what do you understand from confiscation, what happens when there is a confiscation of goods, what GST law comes in to explain when an officer can take an action in relation to the process of confiscation. Then liability of officers and certain other persons. All along we cannot talk only about the registered person. It is duty bound of the officer also to understand what is his role to play when he is acting as a government servant in relation to the penal provisions. So we'll also understand the liabilities of the officers. Cognizable offense and compounding of offense. Now these are two things which we have to keep in backdrop of mind. Very, very draconian provisions. Cognizance of an offense, or in simple terms I'll say cognizable offense. Please write in your working note, cognizable offense. An offense which is considered to be a severe offense. I repeat, an offense which is considered to be a serious category of offense under the law. You could have heard the term called bailable, non-bailable warrant, arrest warrant. So all these cognizable offense are non-bailable offenses, very, very severe in nature. Now, as you progress in your career, you will come across at this point of discussion, maybe once in your lifetime for sure. But this is going to be a, I would say, trendsetter for your practice when you have to handle this particular situation, cognizable offense. Compounding of an offense where you approach to officer concern, where you reduce the magnitude of your exposure of tax and other penal provisions, where you request the officer to give a relaxation on the exposure of the taxes and the penal provisions. Finally, we will summarize all those provisions and see how best this is relevant for our practice to see a glorious understanding of these provisions and how we make use in our day-to-day life once we get qualified as a chartered accountant. Now, before we start with, there are a couple of basics which we need to keep in mind. There will be some questions which will come from your end when we walk through the various provisions. So this slide is going to explain all those basic questions crystal clear. First and foremost, principles of jurisprudence. Principles of jurisprudence penalty. Now this term jurisprudence is a technical term which is used in a law which says that jurisprudence is a theory or a philosophy in law. So this term penalty has not been defined under GST law. When I go to this term penalty on the basis of various jurisprudence or case law settled, this conveys a meaning saying that wherever there is a punishment or deprival of an activity, there is a punishment, there is a deprival of an activity. When I say punishment, this indicates that there is a act which is going to describe what is it I am going to punish. Now, what you can think of punishment? Probably what you call putting the concerned registered person behind the bars, or invoking inquiry and penal provisions, or confiscation of goods or any of the books of accounts, etc., etc. This is all called for punishment. Getting a summons letter itself will be considered as one of the rigorous issue in the regular course of business. So every action starts from the activity called summons. So last session our faculty has covered on this particular element called summons, wherein all these activities will start. Next aspect called deprival of an activity. Now when I say deprival of an activity, you could have seen a couple of movies where wherever there is an inquiry or investigation happening, there will be a disconnectivity of your telephone. There will be a disconnectivity from the outside world. You will be not permitted to go out freely. You will not be permitted to take anything in or out of the premises where search and seizure is happening. Similarly, under the GST law, you will be deprived of an activity. What is that? You are not permitted to issue e-way bill. You are not permitted to file returns. You are not permitted to avail input tax credit. You are not permitted to collect taxes. You are not permitted to collect money from your customer. There is one activity called garnishee order. Garnishee order is again one another punishment which comes in where your right has been deprived by virtue of these legal provisions. So friends, to understand this term penalty, we need to get clear that penalty is as good as a punishment or deprival of an activity as per the statute, here GST law, which is quantified in monetary terms for failure toward an act or responsibility. So whatever responsibility has been casted on me as a registered person, if I have defaulted, if I have deprived, if I have not complied with those responsibility, then the officer concerned can take this particular action called punishment or deprival of an activity. This is my basic understanding of the term penalty. Prosecution. Now, there is one section called section 132 which deals with your prosecution provisions. As I was telling to you, definitely in your career, probably in the first decade or mid of the second decade, you will definitely come across this particular term called prosecution in the process of advancement of your career. This term prosecution conveys institution or commencement of legal proceeding. Institution or commencement of legal proceeding. There is a initiation of a legal proceeding. When I say legal proceeding, this is an activity where as good as your summons, as good as your search and seizure, where action will be taken against the particular registered person or a person in charge, where investigation process activity gets started under the process of your prosecution by placing on record formal charges against the offender. Placing on record formal charges. So what you will say, look, these are the charges which have been identified against you in the process of our investigation, inquiry, audit, and this purpose we would like to take you into our custody. Where provisions of your CPC. CPC indicates your Criminal Procedure Code of Conduct. So Criminal Procedure Code of Conduct, these provisions, CPC provisions, get squarely applied under the GST law for any of the provisions where we refer to these aspects. Then, equality before the law, quantification of penalty on the basis of intent of the person. Now, please understand, this term equality before the law is very, very important where we plead to an officer concerned. Don't give a parity, don't give a disparity, don't be biased. Have a judgment which is unbiased. Don't go merely on the basis of grounds or arguments put in only from the department or revenue side of you. You understand the practical difficulty on the other side, where as an assessee, where I have not been properly guided, we have not been geared up to understand the compliances or nuances of the law. These are all the arguments which come in the process of my prosecution, execution, quantification of penalty, etc. So this term equality, which comes from the backdrop of understanding the culpable mental state or the mind of the assessee, which has to be kept in mind before conforming on any legal proceedings. Then, the term fraud, misrepresentation, suppression of the facts vis-a-vis non-fraudster person. Last session, section 73, section 74. The faculty in the previous session has covered in detail section 73 and section 74, where we have come across this particular term called fraud, misrepresentation, and suppression of facts. Now, these three aspects are as good as Vajrayuda in the hands of a tax officer. Let me put it again. Term called fraud, term called misrepresentation, term called suppression of facts. These three elements are used as Vajrayuda by the tax officer for invoking penal provisions. Now, it is all there in the hands of you as a professional to establish that assessee is not a fraudster person. How best we become the advocate of the client, how best we get into the situation, we guide, we coach, we encourage to have a healthier practices in the business of the assessee, wherein we give an attention to establish this particular element called I am a non-fraudster person. Please don't bring me into the ambit of these three aspects called fraud, misrepresentation, suppression. Section 74 covered with these three aspects. Section 73 covered for non-fraudster person. So with this backdrop, friends, I would recommend, may not be for your examination per se, could be for the purpose of your internal audit, could be for the purpose of your management complaints audit, could be for the purpose of proprietary audit, and finally could be for the purpose of your GST retainership assignment with the client. I would recommend all of you to read the provisions of section 73, section 74, not from theoretical point of view, read from the practical application, how best we can bring in this element called non-fraudster. So this is one important aspect we need to keep in back of mind. As we walk through the provisions, I'll explain you how we can put into assess into this bucket called non-fraudster person. Next, moving on. Bailable offense versus non-bailable. As I have said, cognizable offense, non-bailable. Non-cognizable. Non-cognizable is nothing but a activity which is less serious. There is an offense which is having a less seriousness of commitment of activity which is bailable. All cognizable offenses are non-bailable. All non-cognizable offenses are bailable. So somewhere when we walk through section 132, we will come across these particular aspects. Probably if you ask, sir, we have not done our law, is it required for us to read all these things? I would say, though you're not an expert in the branch of law, it is always good to have the basics of understanding of any of the branch of law when you get into your practice or when you get into your industry. All said and done, it is expected from a CA, chartered accountant, to give an advice wherein the basic elements of any other exposure is well taken care before we give a piece of advice to our clients. So friends, we'll start with our today's discussion. Focus is on this particular chapter, chapter 19, which covers with section 122 till section 138. Today there is half an hour time which was lost because of other activity which was engaged. We will try to cover to the best possible in today's session, and the rest we will cover up in tomorrow's session, that is the next session with the pending aspects. So section 122 to section 138 at a macro level, when I see what is there in us for to read. Section 122, this is one section I would spend at least say 15 to 30 minutes of time on this particular section along with the example, where you will get all the nuances of the GST law covered in detail under section 122. I would say, as like a master batsman, section 122 is my opening master batsman for penal provisions. A must read of section 122, especially if you're inclined to get into practice, if you're inclined to become a consultant. Friends, keep in mind, to become an advisor, to become a consultant, it is not required that you should be an expert in the law. You should know how to swim a ocean. That is good enough for us to travel to when we advise to a particular client. So section 122, starting section, penalty for certain offences. So this has got list of offences. By and large, everything what we can think of was covered to certain extent under section 122. Section 123 deals with your information written. We will understand what is the information written, how it will be used, etc. when we go through that particular provision. Section 124, which deals with your furnishing of statistics. Section 125 is your general penalty. Now, this is your ancillary provision, section 125. Wherever you don't find a scope, officer will come and sit in section 125 for the purpose of levying the penal action. So we'll come to that to understand 125. 126, general disciplines. As I was talking in the beginning of the slide, we should understand what are the general disciplines before a penalty is levied. Never ever get shattered or feared the moment you receive a notice. Most of the time, friends, it so happens when you get into the legal proceedings. Probably you could have seen the court hearings and other cross objections in a court. When you have an element of fear in the back of your spine, your mind stops functioning. Always keep in mind, never ever get shattered the moment you get a legal notice from any of the government authorities or any of your other business partners concerned per se. Please understand what are the contents of that document, what is the legal proceedings involved in that particular thing, how we need to structure our presentation, how we have to tackle with this particular representation. I'll just take a minute for a minute of you to explain at this juncture. Whenever you are replying to any of the documents, it is always equally important for us to understand. First and foremost, is that paper, is that notice, is that inquiry letter is acceptable or not acceptable? Does it have all the compliances under the GST law? One simple example I'll quote here. There's one compliance under the GST law for quoting of DIN. We call as DIN, Document Identification Number. Any correspondence, any official correspondence from the officer concerned, it is mandatory to have this reference to DIN. Assuming you receive a letter on your hand, this letter has got all the details, name of the assessee, registered office, subject violation, details of violation, etc. All this. Finally, they say, if you don't respond to this notice within a period of 7 days, a legal action will be initiated against this particular offense. Now, all said and done, assuming this paper doesn't have a DIN itself, then I would say this is as good as no valid notice. So friends, you should understand what are the basic disciplines and what are the expectation, what is the procedure laid out under the law. So with this backdrop, we need to study this particular section called general disciplines. Section 127, power to impose penalty in certain cases. Now this 127 is a interviewing provision, is a intermediary provision which peeps in which provisions is covered under section 127. 128, power to waive of penalty or fee or both. This section 128 is one thing which I was talking a while ago, where we have to ensure that assessee is not falling into the limb called fraud, misrepresentation, suppression of facts. Rather, assessee should fit into the bucket called a non-fraudster or a complying assessee. This section 128 is a value-added provision when you look from your career perspective. What is a valuation I can give out of my learning out of this session? So this 128 is worth reading once. Section 129, which deals with the detention, seizure, release of goods. I would say 80%, 80% of the high court cases, if you see as of today in any state, right from Jammu and Kashmir till Kerala, I would say Kerala is one state which is far ahead of issuing notices under Section 129. We will go through in detail Section 129 where what could be the scenario where there is a invoking of detention, seizure and release of goods. Detention, I have detained a particular vehicle. There is a vehicle which is carrying some goods. I have stopped that particular vehicle. I have done some verification of documents, inspection, etc. where I notice that there is some anomaly where I'll call for a seizure of that particular conveyance along with the goods. Later, I'll release the goods on payment of the relevant taxes and penalty thereof. So this section 129, friends, I would say as of today in GST law, any high court matters, if you see, one matter is on e-waybill related, that is section 129. Second matter is related to input tax credit. So as of today, if you see the weightage, 80% is going to section 129, 20% is going to your section 16 ITC related chapter. So friends, this section 129 is another section you need to read carefully. Section 130, confiscation of goods, conveyances and levy of penalty. I would pray for God, none of the assessors should fall under section 130, which is a draconian, which is a quite serious provision. When we go through, we will understand 130. 131, confiscation of penalty, not to interfere with other punishments. This particular provision says, look, I cannot have sentiments under GST law saying that already the assessor was punished under any other law, like your CPC provisions. Say, assuming there is what you call income tax rate, or there is one offense under your ED of money laundering cases, etc. Already the assessor was burdened with one of the provisions and actions taken under any other law. Should I also levy provisions under the GST law? 131 comes and says, no, there is no excuse for levy of offences under GST law. Equally, though there is an instigation, though there is an investigation happening in any other law, you have to invoke your provisions under GST law. Section 132, punishment for certain offences. This is one provision which I was talking to you in the beginning of my slide, where your prosecution, your bailable warrant, all those elements of CPC provisions will come in here. All your criminal proceedings which are investigated, interaction, etc. will come into section 132. Practically, I would say you may not have very good exposure because not everyone gets into this. But if you get into this, this is like a gold mine where enormous practice is there in this particular arena called section 132. Next element, 133, liability of officer. As we have discussed, what are the duties casted on an officer under the GST law? Next, 134, cognizance of offences. We will come 132 read with 134. 135, presumption of culpable mental state. Now 135 is as good as your, when there is an execution trial being done in court of law. What is the culpable mental state? Whether the assessee has given a statement. Generally, no, you will see in court of law, Bhagavad Gita के ऊपर हाथ रख के मैं शपथ लेता हूँ. There is a big statement. I'll say, I'll take an oath on Bhagavad Gita. Whatever I'm going to say, it's all facts. I'm not going to conceal or hide any information. Similar state of provisions were embedded into GST law under this particular provision. 136, relevance of statements under certain circumstances, which follows our summons related provisions. 137, offences by company. Again, this is one area where there is a value addition in your practice when you become a consultant for a corporate. You always have to take in, you should be a watchdog, not a bloodhound, where this 137 comes in to explain what are the roles and responsibility of the person who's holding an office. Post qualification, because of your merit, someone says, Praveen, why don't you lend your name? We want to add your name as a board of director in our entity. Getting into a board of director is a prestigious position. Just because if I lend my name for the purpose of creditability to my career, if something goes wrong in the organization, how equally along with the organization, I'll be held responsible is covered under my section 137. Again, section 138, compounding of offences. This is the end of all our discussions in this chapter number 19. So friends, these are the provisions which we are going to cover in today's session. Next, a few of basic things. Jurisdictional authority. Couple of you will have a doubt how the legal proceedings will be done, whether it will be done by the CGST officer, will it be done by the SGST officer, will there be an officer appointed for integrated tax separately, what would be the exposure, what will be the amount quantified, will there be assessment under this law, all those questions will have an answer under this particular slide. Jurisdictional authority, where we will understand in a scenario and offense what authority is vested with what officer and how this gets automatically flown into other law. Identical provisions under state or UT/GST. Friends, whatever we are going to study in our material, all those provisions are picked up from Central GST Act. All the provisions which are there in Central GST Act are parallelly copied into state or respective union territory GST Act. So there is no point of difference between my central law, state law. Whatever we are going to study in central law, equally same provisions are there in state law. Section 20 of IGST Act is one passing on section where all offences or any compliances, any expectation of rules and regulations, procedures under IGST Act has navigated to my CGST law. So anything which I think of to IGST, I'll come back to CGST law. I'll understand the provisions under my CGST law. So section 20 has given a bypassing provision saying that all your compliances expectation, availment of input tax credit, maintenance of books of accounts, filing of returns, payment of taxes, then maintenance of books of accounts, offences and penalty, your tax recovery, dispute, demand provisions, everything is covered under CGST, respective CGST and SGST laws. So what will happen in case of penalty of IGST? Whatever equivalent sum of CGST and SGST is there, when I club these two, the amount what do I get? That is a penalty leviable under IGST law. A question can be asked, sir, I am a dealer registered in the state of Andhra Pradesh. I get into a transaction with a customer in the state of Maharashtra. There is an interstate movement. I am in Andhra Pradesh. My customer is there in Maharashtra. The local state officer of Maharashtra has intercepted the vehicle. Does he have a permission? Does he have an authority to levy a penalty in relation to interstate transaction, IGST transaction? Answer to that question is yes. Section 20 has given that authority to either the central officer or the state officer concerned. One officer taking an action, it is equally covered under the other law. The other officer under the other statute does not come into picture when there is one inquiry, investigation or any proceedings under one jurisdictional authority. Proper officer under one act is deemed to be a proper officer under the respective act. We will see this definition also little a while. Penalty quantified under CGST Act is deemed to be automatically quantified under SGST law. Sir, if there is a late fee which is applied, if there is an interest which is paid under CGST law, do you ask me to pay same amount under the SGST law? Answer is bluntly yes. The amount of late fee, the amount of fine, the amount of complaints which is expected under state law is applicable under the central law, or what is applicable under the central law is equally applicable under the state law. So there is no element of doubt with respect to these complaints. So we will start with our definitions called basic definitions. We start with. Let me see any questions are there till now. So far so good. There is no question till now. Good. So starting point, conveyance. We need to understand the term conveyance defined under section 2, clause 34. Conveyance includes a vessel, aircraft, a vehicle. By and large, wherever we refer to the term called conveyance under our discussion, please understand that this is also including the term called vehicle. Any vehicle which is used for transportation of goods, there we come across this particular language called conveyance and vehicle. So back of mind, you keep in memory, whenever we refer to the term conveyance, it includes your goods vehicle also. Next term, proper officer. In relation to any function to be performed under this act, when I say this act, it's CGST, means commissioner or officer of the central tax. Now, when I say commissioner, Everything cannot be done by commissioner. Officer of the central tax, there will be a jurisdictional authority. Again, referring back to our last session where the faculty has covered powers vested under section 73, 74, right from a superintendent till the commissioner and principal commissioner. That particular provision is where we refer to this proper officer. Any function to be performed under this act means a commissioner or officer of the central tax. So anyone appointed under the GST law, as an officer of central tax should be considered as your proper officer, who's assigned that function by commissioner, who's assigned. So there is a commissioner who assigns the authority to an inspector, to a superintendent. Then that particular inspector or superintendent shall be considered to be a proper officer under this act. Equally, the same provision gets parallelly applied to my state GST law also. Registered person means a person who is registered as section 25 but does not include a person having a UIN. All your UN, United Nations Embassy or World Health Organization, these are the organizations where we call them as person holding UIN. So barring wherever we refer to the GST law, all the provisions are applicable to a registered person, barring all these entities called having a UIN. Example, World Health Organization, any of the World Health Organization having a GST in India. World Bank, if there is a operations of World Bank having an office in India, where in the process of their operations they pay GST, they obtain a unique identity number and the taxes what they have paid gets refunded back automatically. Embassy of any of the foreign nations. These are the definitions which are relevant for us to understand registered person. Important definition called taxable person. Now, this term taxable person means a person. Please look carefully. It doesn't say registered person. A person who is registered or liable to be registered. Registered, we know that this fellow is having a registration certificate and he is having a GSTN. Liable to be registered. Now this comes into two questions. Sir, what if I am liable to register and obtain registration? What if I am liable to register but not obtain registration? Now that is where my entire discussion comes into picture called liable to be registered. So a person who is liable to be registered but not registered, I can call him as a taxable person. A person who is registered though is not liable to be registered, voluntary registration is also called as a taxable person. A person who is registered, a person who is liable to be registered is called as a taxable person. So whenever I refer to the term taxable person, it doesn't include only a registered person. It also includes a person who is liable but not registered. When we go through the provisions, you will have a clarity why we are referring to this term called taxable person, how we will use this term called taxable person. Now, we will move on to our master batsman called section 122, which deals with offences, penalty for certain offences under the GST law. So friends, what I have done, I have summarized entire section 122 in a pictorial format, which is easy for you to remember. Examination, no need to by heart these provisions. Just keep in back of your mind the flow of this particular slide, which helps you to present the answer in your examination. Definitely a theory question cannot be expected because it is a lengthy provision, section 122, where 21 offences are there. So at best probably list out 5-6 offences defined under section 122. At best that could be a theory question. I don't think they'll ask you to write entire provisions of section 122. So to understand section 122, whatever offences are there, whatever offences are possible, I have clubbed into 4 buckets in this particular slide. First bucket called procedural lapses. What do you mean by procedural lapse? Getting registration. You're supposed to register on 1st April. You have registered on say 15th of May. You have delayed in getting registration. You are supposed to file a return. You have delayed in filing a return. You are supposed to make a. You are supposed to give some information while filing the return. You have failed to furnish the information. You are supposed to file a final return. You have failed to. All these are all called procedural lapses. Again, filing of ITC 01, filing of ITC 02. You are supposed to file within 30 days, you file after 35 days. This is covered under first bucket called procedural lapses. Second, fraud, suppression of facts, misrepresentation, etc. Bucket number 2, fraud, suppression of facts, and misrepresentation. Section 74, what we have discussed in the other day by the other faculty, all those scenarios we will cover under second bucket called fraud, suppression of facts, or misrepresentation. Friends, as I was telling you, this is one bucket where it is a vajrayuda for the department officer for invoking my penal provisions. Why? If I don't have this second bucket established, my penal provision could be, say, at best 10% of the revenue. I'll give an example. See, there is a tax I'm supposed to pay for a sum of rupees 50,000, but I have not paid that tax of 50,000. Why I have not paid? Some reasons are there. Now, when the department assessment happens and there was a disclosure, there was an adventure, there was a identification of this element called 50,000, which is quantified by your statutory auditor in his audit report, saying that there is an amount of tax collected to be paid but not paid for a sum of rupees 50,000. Penal provision says 50,000 is equivalent penalty. Now, if I say, sir, this is not by virtue of fraud, suppression of facts, or misrepresentation, then my exposure from 50,000, it gets reduced to 10% of 50,000, called 5,000. So here, if you see, if I establish that I'm a fraudster, I'm having an intention to evade payment of tax, I have suppressed the facts from the department officer, I have a misrepresentation done to the officer concerned, then my penalty is equivalent to the tax. If I don't get into the clutch of this bucket, my exposure from entire tax amount gets reduced. What is the quantification and all? We will understand above. So my second bucket of offenses falls under fraud, suppression of facts, or misrepresentation. Third element called registration. Just a while ago, we were talking about taxable person attached with this term called registration. I'm supposed to get registered but not registered. I'm supposed to do compliances with the registration aspect. I have not done that. All those offenses comes and fall under this particular category called registration. I'll give an example. Sir, I have done a business in the state of Maharashtra. I'm having a place of business. I have taken GST number in the state of Maharashtra. Part of my business, this one customer who is located in Kerala. I have traveled all along to Kerala. I have done the services to my customer in Kerala. I have collected money from my customer in Kerala. I have come back and I have kept quiet. Have you paid taxes? I said, sir, this was an activity done in Kerala, was not an activity done in Maharashtra. So I have not paid taxes. Sir, if you have not paid taxes, first and foremost, there is a non-compliance. Whatever services you have rendered, there is a reference term section 22 where you are supposed to get registered but not registered. All the provisions of registration get invoked where because of failure to get registered, your penal offenses can be invoked. The last and final fag-end element called non-payment of taxes. So friends, the last element, non-payment of taxes, a simple term called I have collected the tax, not paid the tax. I am supposed to collect the tax but not collected. I have supposed to collect 18%, I have collected 12%. All those particular adjustments, all those transactions will come into my bucket number 4 called non-payment of taxes. So when we read this section 122, please keep in mind, these are the maximum 4 buckets which are relevant for our understanding. All the offenses which is there in section 122, by and large come and fit into these 4 buckets. As of today, section 122 has got 21 offenses listed. So is it good enough if I read entire section 122? Answer is definitely yes. If you have read and understood all the provisions which are there under section 122, we are taking care of our penal provisions. Coming to our further discussion, section 122 starts with where a taxable person. Now friends, definition of taxable person, a registered person, person liable to get registered. A person registered under the GST law and a person who is liable to get registered is covered in the term called taxable person. Where a taxable person who supplies any goods or services or both without issuance of an invoice or issues an incorrect or false invoice with regard to any such supply. Now here they are referring to the term called supply. You're making a supply without issuance of an invoice. So what can go wrong? I have made a supply. I have made a supply. Once I have made a supply, I have not issued without issuance of an invoice. Without issuance of an invoice. Now, if you don't issue an invoice, what can go wrong? I have not collected tax, I have not paid tax. Probably I have collected tax but not paid tax. Now, how can it be possible? I have collected money inclusive of taxes. Customer doesn't know that the price which I have charged is inclusive of taxes. So there is an offense which is coming here where I am supplying any goods or services. When you are supplying, you are supposed to issue a tax invoice without issuance of invoice. So if you don't issue an invoice, it is an offense. Or issues an incorrect or false invoice. Issues a incorrect invoice. What is an incorrect invoice? What is an incorrect invoice? I have supplied goods for 10 units, but I have showed 1 unit. The price I have showed properly, but the quantity I have showed only for 1 quantity instead of 10 quantity. Or false invoice. False invoice what? Probably quoting a mismatch in the product code, product description, or GST rate, HSN classification, etc. When there is a non-compliance with regards to such supply, then that can be called as a offense under clause number 1. So here it says you have supplied without issuing an invoice, or you have supplied with an invoice which is incorrect or false, which is incorrect or false. This is my first offense under my section 122. Issues an invoice, no doubt. Sir, you have asked me to issue an invoice, I have issued invoice. Without supply of goods or services, this is called bill trading. This is called bill trading. Without supply of goods or services, I have issued a bill without supplying goods or services are both in violation of the provisions of the Act. So how can I issue a tax invoice without supplying the goods or services? This is called bill trading. Bill trading where movement of goods does not happen. A supplier sitting in say Gujarat, customer sitting in Maharashtra. There is a supplier in Gujarat raised a bill on a customer in Maharashtra. This Maharashtra customer raises one more tax invoice from Maharashtra to another person in Bihar. So the goods which is moving from, technically there is no movement of goods. Bill says goods are moving from Gujarat to Maharashtra. Before the goods reach Maharashtra, this fellow has given instruction to give a delivery to customer in Bihar. No movement of goods is happening, but an invoice was issued. Now that is a transaction where they say a person who is issuing an invoice without supplying of goods or services. Now, please keep in mind all your auditing skills coming to picture here. Don't read this as a theory. Read this as a fantastic assignment. How best an officer can discover this particular transaction. So, is there a way the officer can discover that there is a supply where there is no movement of goods but a tax invoice was issued? How can the officer discover that? Now, this comes with a practical exposure where there is a compliance called e-way bill. So whenever there is a movement of goods, there is an e-way bill required. Now, I think there was one session on e-way bill, which the faculty has explained in detail. There is one complaint called, whenever I raise a e-way bill, there is an element called e-Vahan validation. Friends who have exposure to internship, they will understand this, what I'm talking about, the example. Who have no exposure or who have less exposure to indirect taxes, please understand this provision this way. When I raise a e-way bill, there is an automation of my details. The moment I enter the vehicle number, my vehicle number is validated with a website called e-Vahan. Write down in your working note, e-Vahan, not from examination point of view, for your career and academic point of view. The e-way bill gets validated with a document called e-Vahan. Sir, what if the vehicle number is a dummy number? The moment I put a dummy number, e-Vahan portal says this is a invalid vehicle number. Can I generate e-way bill? Of course I can generate e-way bill. It says a warning saying that look, this vehicle number what you have entered was not a vehicle which is registered under any of the state registration vehicle act. So this is a alert which is triggered. Now what if the vehicle started commutation? Right from Gujarat, it has to come to Maharashtra. En route, before reaching Maharashtra, it has to be routed to Bihar. Friends, keep in mind, every goods movement which happens through a national highway, there are several toll gates where the vehicle has to pass through. Every toll gate, there is a registration of movement of a vehicle. Now, this is the information which is handily available with the GST officer. We are talking about e-integration, electronic integration. Entire data is there in the hands of the officer concerned. So whoever is studying for your final examination, I would caution you, don't read this subject just as if you are reading for your examination. Read as if there is an enormous scope for your practice where you apply your auditing skills, you apply your that is your IT information ISCA paper, which is also going to add valuation of all these checks and balances. So one factor called e-way bill reconciliation. Using that process, my officer can find out if there is a issuance of invoice where there was actually no movement of goods. Also, is there a scope for the officer to find out there is something called production? When I'm doing a manufacturing activity, what is my installed capacity? What is actual capacity? When someone does a technical inspection of my factory, I know that entire year I can produce 100,000 units out of this factory. In my e-way bill, my GSTR1, when I have given quantum HSNY summary, that HSNY summary has given 150,000 units produced. Now, when I have installed capacity for 100,000 units, when I have put for 150,000 units, there itself I'll get to know that there is something suspicious transaction with this assessee. So information which you are fading in GSTR1, information linked with my production capacity is something where the officer can find out that there is a issuance of an invoice. Then third, collects any amounts as tax but fails to pay the same to the government beyond a period of 3 months. Now, this is another interesting factor. Sir, there is a collection of a tax. Will there be a possibility that a tax which was collected but failed to pay to the government? Definitely possibility, yes. Wherever there is a working capital issue, wherever you are doing your statutory, you will report to the management saying that were there any tax disputes, was there any tax arrears, collection of EPF and remittance, collection of ESA and remittance, or GST which was collected but not paid. All these are the transactions which come into this clause, collection of any amount of tax but fail to pay the same to the government. How long? Beyond a period of 3 months. Beyond a period of 3 months. From the date on which such payment becomes due. Question comes here. Sir, I have collected the tax in the month of August 2019. As on March 2019, that was paid. Now, it was collected in August but paid in March 2020. August month I have collected, I have paid in the month of March. Can I invoke penal provisions under this law? Collects any amount but fails to pay. There is a failure to pay. As on March I have paid. When I have paid, my penal provisions will not get attracted to this particular transaction. So friends, keep in mind, when we are reading these particular aspects, it is very, very important for us to understand that you read in between the lines, but fails to pay. It is a continuous activity. Once I've remitted, this failure to pay gets a seizure at that particular point in time. Now, all this is your interpretational skills where you apply when you argue with a tax officer concerned. Next element called collects any tax in contravention of the provisions of this act, but fails to pay the same to the government beyond a period of 3 months. Now, the above element says collects and fails to pay. This element says collects the tax in contravention of the provisions of this act. Example, composition. You're not supposed to collect a tax under composition scheme. You've collected and you've not paid. You've collected a tax under composition. You're violating your contravention norms. This is something which is a serious offense which we have to keep in mind. So these are the 4 things which we have to keep in mind. Now, as I was talking, remember always first slide. One talks about registration, second talks about your fraud, misrepresentation, third talks about your registration, fourth talks about your non-payment of tax. So these are the 4 buckets. Which we need to keep in mind when we are talking about these offenses. So quickly, let me see if there are any questions raised so that we will discuss. Sridhar raised a question. Explain as per your caption procedural registration for non-payment of tax and fraud, etc. Explain as per your caption procedural registration, non-payment of tax and fraud. Yes, Sridhar. See, you're supposed to get registered. You're not registered. Non-payment of tax. Now, you know that there is a threshold limit for the purpose of getting registered under Section 22. Though you have exceeded your threshold limit, you ought to get registered but not registered. For a moment, let us assume that 20 lakhs is my threshold limit. Now, I have gone beyond the threshold limit. I am supposed to collect the tax but not pay. That is the offense where non-payment of taxes, where the officer comes and says, look, your 26 AS. Now again, where is the clue for the officer? When the officer looks into your form 26 AS, income tax, your TDS certificate, my 26 AS says that there is a total income of say 38 lakhs, where income under section 194J itself is covered for a tune of 38 lakhs. Now what is a magical figure? 20 lakhs. Beyond 20 lakhs, you ought to register but not registered. There the officer comes and says, look, you are supposed to register but not registered, and the tax you have not paid. Now there comes your inclusive collection. Whatever money I have collected, it is presumed that this is included inclusive of taxes. Officer demands that particular amount as a tax not paid. So Sridhar, I hope I have answered your question, Sridhar. There's one more question from Sridhar again. 122.1 comes under procedural or non-payment of tax. Sridhar, this 122.1 has got various penalties, 21 penalties, which is having a mix and match. One, procedural related complaints. Second, non-payment of tax. I would say getting registration but not registered, procedural lacuna. Getting registered on 1st April, registered on say 15th of August, procedural lapse. Having said that, payment of tax. I'm supposed to collect the tax and pay, but I have not paid. Having registered, I am supposed to collect the tax. I have not collected the tax. Non-payment of tax. I have collected under composition. I don't know that I am under composition. I have failed to pay that particular tax. Non-payment of tax. All those things gets covered under section 122.1. Hope I have clarified your point, Sridhar. There's one question from Ambika. In case of 3, tax is paid within 3 months, then no penalty. Definitely no, Ambika. I have collected the tax but not paid. Then my section 122 comes into picture. I have collected and I have paid. Now how did I pay? I have paid with interest. I have paid with interest. Please recollect one element, Ambika. Intent to evade payment of tax. Your intent to evade payment of tax under the ambit of fraud, suppression of facts, misrepresentation, all this gets aside where I say, look, I have collected the tax, but I have defaulted in paying. I have paid that amount with interest under section 50. If I paid, though it is outstanding beyond 3 months, no penalty is applicable, Ambika. Answer to your question is that. While explaining section 122, then please mention in which bucket it falls so that we can keep it. Yes, Sridhar, definitely. Sridhar says, sir, when you are explaining these elements, please refer to which bucket so that it will be easy for us to remember these provisions. Definitely, Sridhar, your point is taken care. I'll definitely cover the respective buckets. So friends, just keep in mind procedural, fraud, registration, non-payment of taxes. These are the 4 buckets. These are the 4 buckets. We'll go through and understand all our provisions under section 122 in any of these aspects. Procedural, fraud, registration, non-payment of taxes. Now, there could be overlapping of any of these buckets. That also we will understand each of those things. So coming with section 122.1 under that clause 1, without issuance of invoice. That is, without issuance of invoice is a procedural lacuna, and also if you have collected the tax and not paid, then it comes under the bucket called non-payment of taxes. I have issued an invoice with a false information, procedural lapse. I have not issued invoice at all. Again, this is it comes under non-payment of tax added with your procedural law, which gives a weightage, more weightage, non-payment of tax. When I say I have not issued an invoice, where is the question in showing in my GSTR1? Where is the payment of taxes? Then point number 2, issues an invoice without supply of goods. This comes under your procedural lacuna, where I am supposed to issue invoice only when there is a supply. When there is again the procedural read with your intent to evade payment of tax. This is something where you have to keep in mind. When I read this point, can the officer say there is an intention to evade payment of tax, or there is a misrepresentation, there is a suppression of facts? Now, probably answer would be yes under this point number 2. I have issued an invoice, bill trading. That could be your intention to do away fraudster activity. Then my point number 2 comes in bucket number 2, fraud related activity. Collects an amount but fails to pay, procedural element. Or again, non-payment of taxes. If I've paid with delay, then it comes as a procedural lacuna. If I have collected but not paid, non-payment of tax, bucket number 4. Collects a tax in contravention of the provisions, bucket number 1. In violation of this act, procedural lacuna. Next, moving on. Fails to deduct the tax under section 51, which deals with your TDS. This provision says, look, you are a e-commerce operator. You have been not e-commerce. This deals with your government contracts. Government entity is supposed to withhold something called TDS. So if there is a deduction under section 51, there is a short deduction or no deduction, or where the deduction was done but not paid to the government, then all those failure, procedural lacuna. A procedural lacuna, if deducted, there is a non-payment of tax, comes under bucket number 4. I have deducted, instead of 2%, I have deducted 1%. Again, comes under bucket number 1, procedural lacuna. So there is a mix and match where, given the clarity of transaction, it moves from one of the bucket to another bucket. Sir, I have registered, I have obtained a TDS registration. As per the law, I am supposed to withhold 2%, I have withheld 1%. As per the law, I am supposed to deduct CGST, SGST, I have deducted as IGST. Now, all these are procedural lacuna. I have deducted but not paid continuously beyond 3 months, comes into your bucket number 4, non-payment of tax. Again, similarly, TCS provision, whatever we have discussed under TCS, TDS, TCS, e-commerce operator. I have to deduct the TCS but not deducted. I have to deduct 2% but deducted 1%. I have deducted but not paid. All these aspects comes under my, if this is a procedural lacuna, bucket number 1. Having deducted, I have not paid, comes into your bucket number 4. Now, sir, what if I'm supposed to get registered under TCS but not registered? Then it comes to your bucket number 3. First and foremost, you're supposed to get registered as a TCS operator. I'll give an example, friends, here. If you look into your client profile, there could be one fellow who is very good in this software management. This fellow has developed a portal, e-commerce portal, where he has tied up with various people saying that, look, whoever wants to get to avail the services of a transportation vehicle. So what they will do, they just say transportation of goods. The moment they search in Google pages, my website comes where all of you who are empaneled with me, you will come as a list of service providers. So when I'm engaged into this activity where I'm connecting my end customer with the service provider, I'm acting as an intermediary where I'm just collecting the money and passing on the money. I don't know that I'm supposed to get registered. That is a provision where, though I'm supposed to get registered as an e-commerce operator, but I'm not registered. There itself, there is a non-compliance which is coming here, bucket number 3. Next, takes or utilizes input tax credit without actual receipt of goods. Without actual receipt of goods. Now, this is again bucket number 2, intention to evade payment of tax, fraudulent activity. That gets covered under this particular bucket number 3, saying that you have availed or you have utilized your input tax credit without actual receipt of goods. Friends, this is very, very important element when you do your internal audit or statutory audit. Now, this element I would recommend, don't look it as a theory. Look how the department officer is going to verify. Go from that angle. You get a love and affection to this provisions, how you will do an investigation before even a department law audit happens. First and foremost, e-way bill reconciliation. My supplier sitting in Tamil Nadu, we are doing audit of a person who is registered in the state of Maharashtra. This person has taken input tax credit of 1,80,000 on say 30th December 2019. Now, when I'm doing a reconciliation, I got to know that e-way bill was raised by the supplier on 30th December. Physically, goods were received on 2nd of January, 3rd of January. Now, this is a point where my e-way bill, like my purchase accounting entry happened on 2nd January, but e-way bill was raised on 30th December. When I do that reconciliation, I'll get to know I've availed or utilized input tax credit without even actual receipt of goods. This comes by way of a e-way bill reconciliation. So there are modes where my offense can be identified by a department officer. So what is important for you as a professional? I have to do all these various activities, part of my audit, part of my GST assignment, or internal audit to unearth all this kind of lacuna before the officer. So friends, here I would put into bucket number 2. Hope you have noted on all bucket 1, 2, 3, 4, and as you go through, please make a listing so that it will be easy for you to identify. Fraudulently obtains refund, bucket number 2, fraud, intention to commit, cheat, evade, misrepresentation, suppression of facts. I've obtained a refund fraudulently. Now, how did you obtain? I've created a fictitious bills. I have availed input tax credit without even actual receipt of goods, and I filed a refund application. I got a refund. That's called fraudulent activity, bucket number 2. Next. Takes or distributes input tax credit in contravention of Section 20 IST. If you recollect, there was one principle under Section 20 called IST. Takes or distributes input tax credit in contravention of Section 20. Now here, I wouldn't say much valuation can be given to this. It is just as good as a mathematical equation. If you recollect our discussion on input tax credit, IST, there was an equation. Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4. 4 units registered in 4 different states. There is a head office in the state of Tamil Nadu. This head office has to distribute the input tax to various other 3 units. When I have to distribute, there is a proportionate equation. My turnover of Unit 1 divided by total turnover. When I apply this mathematical equation, assuming there was a clerical error in my mathematical equation, if you commit a error in that particular thing, and this was noted when the departmental audit is happening. Ambika, to answer your question, not though linked with your question, it comes indirectly addressed in this particular provision where if at all there was a mathematical equation where I have distributed excess credit or short credit in violation of Section 20, because there is a arithmetical error that gets covered under this point number 9. I put into bucket number 1 called your procedural lacuna. Then falsifies, substitutes financial records or produces fake accounts, bucket number 2, or furnishes any false information written with an intention to evade payment of tax. Now all this gets sum up to my bucket number 2. Falsifies, substitutes financial records, produces fake accounts. Now please understand very, very strongly in your back of mind. I cannot have one set of accounts for income tax purpose. I cannot have one set of books of accounts for GST law. It happens most of the unorganized sector where the assessee comes and says, sir, I have to get a bank loan. To get a bank loan, my bank person says, you show this much of income so that you get an entitlement. So what I have done for the purpose of income tax, I have shown X amount. For the purpose of GST, what actually invoices have issued, I have paid tax only or GST only on that particular turnover. Now, friends, that is a transaction where this particular element of falsifies, substitute financial records, produce fake accounts or documents, punishes any false information. All this gets summed up into your point number 2, where intention to evade payment of tax is the key element which is there in the back of mind of the assessee concern. This gets into your bucket number 2. Is liable. Who is liable? A person. Who is that person? A taxable person. Always refer back to our beginning of section 122. It says a taxable person. When I say taxable person, already registered. Is liable to be registered. So this says a person is already registered, liable to be registered. A person is liable to be registered. That is also covered under this act, but fails to obtain a registration. I'll give an example here. When we are reading about the chapter called registration, there is a topic called casual taxable person. We have read something called casual taxable person. A person who is dealing in textile products. See, this gentleman is in the state of Punjab. So this gentleman who is registered in the state of Punjab, he goes for participation in a trade exhibition in Delhi. Now, when he has gone for trade exhibition in Delhi, what happened? He has participated in trade exhibition. Whatever goods he has sold. He has come back and paid the taxes. Now, how do we get to know there was a movement of goods? How that movement happened? There is a issuance of e-way bill. Now I have raised a e-way bill saying that other than supply, I taken the goods to Delhi. Whatever amount of goods I can sell, I have sold in Delhi. Again, I have prepared a e-way bill to bring it back. Other than supply, I have raised an inward supply e-way bill. I have brought that back. When I have stayed in a hotel in Delhi, I gave a registration number of Punjab. So that hotel fellow, when he charged SGST, CGST in the state of Delhi, it reflected in my GSTR 2A. That trade exhibition, I have given my GST number of Punjab to the rent what I'm paying. Now there are evidences which I've left out where I'm liable to be registered in the state of Delhi, Union Territory, but I failed to register. Offences under section 122, registration bucket number 3 comes into picture here. Now this is an example where a person is liable to be registered but not registered. I'll come to another example. Sir, I am registered in the state of Kerala. I'm doing a business activity in the state of Telangana. I'm registered in Kerala. I'm doing a business activity in the state of Telangana. I have issued an invoice from Kerala. I'm not registered in the state of Telangana. Is that okay? Is that a complaint under the law? I have raised a IGST. Is that a complaint under the GST law? Now, please keep in mind, probably a couple of examples were thrown by the faculty. From this section perspective, look at it this way. What activity you are doing? Sir, I'm doing a works contract. How you have done? Sir, I have a concrete mixture. I have various plant and machinery for this particular project. I have moved from Kerala to Telangana. I did the work. I called that as a service activity. What I have done? I raised an IGST bill and I have charged to my customer in Telangana. Is that okay? When you look into your GST law, section 22, wherever there is an activity performed where you are supposed to get registered but not registered, that provision gets invoked under GST law. So this penal action will be taken where you are liable to register but not registered. Now what if in the process of your contract, works contract, you buy 100 bags of cement? Can you say, please deliver it in the state of Telangana and raise a bill to my head office in Kerala. Bill to Kerala, ship to Telangana. I'm consuming that cement in the state of Telangana, but I'm asking my supplier to bill it to Kerala IGST. Now, this is all where your question of eligibility of input tax credit, all this comes revolving with this basic element called liability to register. Because you are doing a business activity where there is a permanence, where you are supposed to have a place of business, office, etc., liaison office, whatever you call. You are liable to be registered but not registered. So friends, this is one example where under the various business process, though you are registered in one state, officer will say you are supposed to be registered in this state but fail to obtain a registration. Deals with your bucket number 3. Furnishes any false information. The moment I refer to false, your bucket number 2. With regards to registration particulars, either at the time of applying for registration or subsequently. We call this as what you call body shop business, where people overnight turn their business within no point in time. They give all false evidences for the purpose of registration. Bucket number 2. Why? Creation of fake invoice, creation of fictitious transactions, all that comes in your bucket number 2. Intention to cheat. Next. Obstructs or prevents an officer. This is a procedural, bucket number 1. I have prevented an officer, I have obstructed an officer in the part of discharging their duties, bucket number 1. Transports any taxable goods. Here they say transports any taxable goods without the cover of documents as may be specified. We are referring to e-way bill provisions. I have transported taxable goods where there is no without a cover of documents. What do you mean by cover of documents? Issuance of a tax invoice, issuance of an e-way bill. So if you have transported not exempted goods, only taxable goods, that's why I have highlighted the red color. Examination, probably a question can be tested from this element. Mr. ABC, registered in the state of Maharashtra, has he's into the business of selling agricultural products and machinery. Machinery in agriculture produce is taxable under GST law. And the rice and paddy which is sold is an exempted activity. So he has undertaken to deliver goods worth 20 lakhs to a customer in the state of Punjab. Examine the penal provisions where e-waybill was not issued, where we will refer to this term called taxable goods. E-waybill is required only when the goods are taxable. If exempted, Rule 138 says that no required to issue an e-waybill. Offence under Section 122 does not get invoked. So please refer only when there is a transportation where it is in relation to taxable goods without cover of a document. Now again, I'll come into this particular point this way where Ambika has raised one valid question. Sir, is there a way where we can discover this particular element? Sir, definitely it is possible where I do a e-waybill reconciliation. When I look into transactions for a month, if a threshold limit of 50,000 and above, I have to raise an e-waybill. State to state, there is a variance of compliance. All those transactions which is meeting the threshold limit, no cover of e-waybill. Offence under GST law, transportation. Suppresses turnover, bucket number 2, intention to evade payment of tax, leading to evasion of tax. Now, this element suppression of turnover, when we read as a theory, definitely you will not appreciate this. Get into the shoes of an officer. How all best possible means he'll apply to identify there is a suppression. Please keep in mind, it is very important for the tax officer to establish an evidence in court of law to say that there is a suppression. It is not easy to raise an allegation on the assessee. When an allegation is being raised, there should be an evidence. What is the source of evidence? Your income tax return, your Form 26AS. There could be transaction where TDS or TCS is there. New section under income tax, section 2071C 1H, where TCS under income tax is being coming into picture. All these are summing up where data is available electronically to the income tax officer, where he can discover that there is a suppression. Next, point number 16. Fails to keep, maintain or retain books of accounts and other documents in accordance with the provisions of this Act or rules made thereunder. Fails to keep, maintain and retain books. I'll give an example. Sir, I'm a transporter. I have failed to maintain or retain books. Can the GST officer punish me saying that I have committed an offence? What is required under books of accounts when you refer to section 35? Please make a note. I'm not going with the provision sections to make you memorize. I'm interlinking various provisions, how the officer is going to levy a penal provision. When I refer to section 35, which talks about your records and books of accounts, where there is a requirement of a go-down operator to maintain books of accounts with respect to consignor, consignee and the vehicle details. Sir, I'm a go-down operator. I don't maintain books of accounts. Can there be an offence under section 122? Now, please recap. Section 122 starts with the word saying that where a taxable person, go-down operator, warehouse operator is not a person liable to be registered until the threshold limit is not met. Go-down operator or warehouse operator is not a person liable to be registered under section 24, compulsory registration. By virtue of section 22-24, I am not liable to get registered, then I am out of the clutch of this complaints under section 122. So this particular element says that if you are a registered person who have failed to maintain or retain books of accounts. Now, important aspect, retention of books of accounts. So there is a earthquake, there is a natural calamity. My books of accounts are not available. I have taken utmost care to have data backup, etc. Because of natural calamity, entire books of accounts are not available. Can I say I have committed an offence? Answer would be there is one last provision called compounding of offences, and there is in between one more section 128. I'll come into that to explain how do we deal with this particular provision. As of now, we say I have taken utmost care as a registered person. I have taken utmost care to maintain books of accounts. Events beyond my control, there is an event occurred where I was made incapable of compliance under the GST law. Then I would say I don't fall into the clutches of non-compliance provided I make a written communication to the concerned officer. When I go to 128, I'll explain in detail. Next, fails to furnish information or documents called for by an officer. This I linked with my section dealing with your summons. Wherever there is a summons issued or wherever there is an inquiry or any information called by an officer, and I fail what to furnish that information. So please keep in mind, wherever a notice is received from a department, it is the responsibility of the taxable person to attend to that particular notice. Though there was information called for, I have not responded to that notice, which is called by an officer, then under this particular provision, I will be held penally. It is an offence. What it says, fails to furnish information or documents called for in accordance with the provisions of this act or rules made thereunder, or furnishes false information. Namesake I have given some information without even checking what is that information, which is a false information. I put into bucket number 2, false information and documents. The CFO is busy, finance director is busy. There was a notice for giving some input tax working for a particular month called by an officer. So what happened? This statement was prepared by a junior accountant. Out of the busy schedule, this was given to the department person. Furnishes false information. The junior who's preparing the information is not good in Excel. While copying or giving links, he has given a wrong data, wrong updated data. False information. You will be falling under bucket number 2, intention to cheat, commit fraud, etc. Now you have to establish that you don't have that intention. Otherwise, officer will say you have committed a fraud in terms of giving a false information. Next, supplies or transports or stores goods which he has reasons to believe are liable for confiscation. Supplying the goods, transporting the goods, storing the goods. I supply the goods where I have a reason to believe what these goods are liable for confiscation. What? The goods are liable for confiscation. Why liable for confiscation? There is a violation of the GST law. The goods have been transported without a tax invoice. Goods have been transported as if it is an exempted goods. I'll give an example. Say there is a BD wrapper. There is a BD wrapper which is taxable under the GST law. I have a consignment called BD wrapper, but I have shown as if it is what you call a rice, which is put into the bag consignments. If I look into the truck, say 300 bags can be loaded. 200 bags I have the BD wrapper, 100 bags I have the rice, saying that this entire consignment is a rice where there is no e-way required and the goods have been moved. I have reasons to believe that the goods are liable for confiscation because I have disclosed a wrong information. So I'm the person who's supplying the goods. I'm the person who is the transporter transporting the goods, or I'm storing those goods where I know that this goods were subjected to confiscation. But in spite of that, having reasons to believe that this is a liability, I have got into any of this activity, then it is again an offense. My bucket number 2 comes into picture. Issues any invoice or document by using the registration number of another registered person. Commonly happens where there is a one accounts team where there are 4 or 5 entities working in a particular umbrella. Small business entities where they have 4 or 5 registrations in a bigger compound premises. Why they have 4 premises? Maybe your family disputes, or maybe for your industry land allocation. When there is a what you call business which is getting set up, the various governments, state governments give a land with a nominal price to promote a particular business. So what I'll do, my existing business I'll split into 2-3 business for the purpose of getting a land allotment, where a common accountant is working in different places. By mistake, using one registration number, he has used another registration. This is called an offense under GST law. Tampers with or destroys any material evidence. Again, this is an offense. The last and final, dispose of tampers with any goods that have been detained, seized, or which have been attached under this act. These are the list of offences which are covered under section 122. Let me come into a couple of questions. I don't have the name of student. It is just mentioned 111. I would request you to put your email ID or name so that it will be easy to explain. E1 concept is updated recently on the website. What about earlier period for which audit has not been conducted till now? This, I don't know the name of the student who raised this question. I am saying that this is one of the technique which is available under the GST law. We need to travel, we need to update the changes which is happening in the law. Especially with that backdrop, we have to see how the assessment is going to happen. Right now it is E1. Prior to that E1, there is no linking. However, there is a movement of goods where there is a check post. Every check post there is a toll gate. Now most of these toll gates, there is again automation. If you remember, there is what you call FASTag. Every payment should be linked with your FASTag. So that's how various data is getting collated for the anti-evasion team to get into this revenue escaping transactions. So answer to your question is that from the backdrop of E1. Prior to that, there are different techniques which are relevant where e-waybill has to be issued but not issued, etc. I can get into the element of suppression of revenue. Sneha has a question. Can we say that bill to supply transactions is an exemption to 122? Definitely, answer is yes, Sneha. Provided bill to ship to transaction, we have established the evidence that actual movement of goods happened and the recipient has received the goods. There is one question from Sneha. Very good question. Practically, you have to see this transaction. Then in bill to ship to transaction, there was a violation under section 122. What it says, where I have availed the input tax credit without actual receipt of goods or services. Now there, I wouldn't say it is a violation as long as I can establish that the recipient has actually received the goods. Now sitting in Maharashtra, now example we are talking, there was a supplier in Gujarat, I'm in Maharashtra, my recipient is in Bihar. Sitting in Maharashtra, how do I get to know the goods were actually received in Bihar? What documentary evidence you have? After 2 years, after 3 years down the line, when there is an audit happening, how can you establish that the recipient has received the goods? This is something which is important for you, Sneha, to establish that the recipient has received the goods and you have a document evidence to take care of that particular aspect. Hope I've answered your question, Sneha. There's one question from Sridhar. In registration from warehousing, is it covering activities column where the box to be checked? In registration form, warehousing is covered in activities column where the box to be checked. Okay. Related to registration, Sridhar, I will declare myself. Why am I getting registered under GST law? Under what activity I am getting registered under GST law? If I am only a warehouse operator, I'll just tick that particular thing saying that I am a service provider into the activity of warehousing. Again, are you just getting a registration for storing the goods without supplying any services? Then there is no registration which is required for this particular activity. Only if you're a taxable service provider where you ought to get registered under section 22 or section 24, then this element is required, Sridhar. Next, continuation to that, Sridhar says, fraud and misstatement, onus to prove will be department or taxable person. Sridhar, I would put it this way. Department person says there is an intention to evade payment of tax, which was the reason I am levying a tax and a penalty. He will say there is no evidence to say that you have taken adequate care for not invoking penal provisions. Sridhar raised a question. Sir, is it a responsibility on the department officer? Is it a responsibility on the assessee to establish that the intention, the culpable mental state, please write these technical terms, culpable mental state. How do we establish that this mental state does not exist to evade payment of tax? I would say always responsibility is on the assessee, on the registered person to prove that there is no culpable mental state. For the department officer, he will say, look, as per the law, you ought to pay tax, you are not paid. As per the law, you ought to get registered, not registered. As per the law, you are supposed to comply with the procedural things, you are not complied. He will simply say, because you have intention not to comply, you are not complied. It is easy for the officer. Always remember, when you go for an audit, looking from this side of table, it is always easy to ask 10 questions. Sitting on the other side of the table as a person who is executing, it is very tough for him to comply with all the things and comply with the audit requirement. The same way here, when there is a departmental assessment, it is always important for us to keep in mind that we need to establish all this intent to evade payment of tax is not existing. Wait for a couple of slides where you get a clarity on that. Section 122 says, look, any of these 21 offences are noted, penalty shall be higher of 10,000 or amount equivalent to tax evaded, tax not deducted under 51 TDS, section 52 TCS, input tax availed or passed on or distributed IST principal, refund claim. So section 122 says, look, either 10,000 or the tax evaded. Now, sir, in case of a procedural lacuna, I have issued an invoice, false invoice. Where is the tax evasion? I have paid 10,000, I have to pay 10,000, I have paid. So there, because there is a false information, instead of 10 quantity, I have showed only one quantity. Instead of showing a proper HSN, you have showed a wrong HSN. There is no tax escape, but penal provision of 10,000 will be applicable. So it says either 10,000 or what tax evaded if there is a element of tax evasion. TDS, TCS, 51, 52, deducted but not paid, short deducted, etc. Then ISD, erroneously clerical mistake happened, or refund claimed fraudulently. So any of these activities, what is the amount quantifiable under that activity? Either that amount or 10,000. Higher of these two will be a section, penal provision under section 122. Now, most of the times, section 122, 10,000 will be invoked where any of the procedural, like bucket 1, bucket 2, bucket 3, bucket 4. Bucket 1, mere procedural lacuna, 10,000, where the amount was paid, but there is a procedural lacuna. Bucket 2, intention to evade payment of tax. To the extent the intent exists, that gets quantified under section 122(1). Bucket number 3, registration. Again, I have delayed. There is a gap in registration, procedural lacuna. Again, 10,000. Bucket number 4, payment of tax. To the extent you have evaded the tax, that gets covered, quantified under 122(1). So when I look into 4 buckets, wherever amount is not quantifiable, mere 10,000. Where amount is quantifiable, straight away that amount. Higher of these two will be levied as a penalty under section 122(1). 122(2), this is one particular provision. 80% of the departmental assessment, gets attracted with this particular provision called section 122 subsection 2. Friends, very, very important to keep in mind this provision where it says any registered person who supplies any goods or services or both on which tax has not been paid, that is your point number 1. Short paid, point number 2. Erroneously refunded, point number 3. Input tax credit has been wrongly availed or utilized. Now this entry under section 122 subsection 2 is a specific provision covering 4 elements. So can there be a penalty under 122(1), 122(2)? Answer would be no, only one will be covered. Which is straight applicable to your case? Only that will be covered. 122(2) comes into place where I have taken input tax credit wrongly, which is not to be taken. I have to pay tax at the rate of 18%, but I have paid at 12%, short paid. I have filed for a refund application, which is not to be filed, erroneously refunded. Point number 4, input tax credit wrongly availed or utilized. I'll draw your attention to this phrase called input tax credit wrongly availed or utilized. Hope every one of you have a clarity referring to this term called availment of input tax, utilization of input tax credit. Availment. There is a purchase bill. I have taken input tax credit on the basis of purchase bill. I have updated my GSTR 3B saying that this is a purchase. That credit goes and sits in my electronic credit ledger. Have you utilized that particular input tax credit? No, I have not utilized because my input tax is much higher than my output tax. So question of availment comes into picture. Next, utilized. Input tax wrongly utilized. I have taken an input tax wrongly utilized. Now, where does this wrongly availed, wrongly utilized comes into picture? I'll give you an example to correlate. So there is a bill which I have received. Most of the practical cases, when you look into the audit, when you look into the purchase register, accountant, by and large, many of the corporates are not professionals like you or me, where they have read all the provisions of GST law. They look into the bill. The moment you look into the bill, there is a GST number of supplier. There is my GST number. GST rate is there. GST amount is there. bifurcation of IGST, CGST, SGST at times may not be there, or this fellow doesn't know that this is a bifurcation required. So he sees the bill. On the bill, CGST, SGST is there. I'm punching an accounting entry in Tally. The moment I have entered my GST number of supplier, which is in other state, say I'm registered in Tamil Nadu, I'm accounting a bill. I have received a bill issued by a supplier in Maharashtra in relation to hotel accommodation. In Tally, I have created a vendor master. In vendor master, I have given GST number, say Maharashtra 27. The moment I select that, IGST ledger comes into picture. So what I do blindly, CGST, SGST is there. Because Tally is giving me IGST ledger, I have clubbed these two and I have put into that called IGST. Wrongly availed. So here there is a, you could say intention, you could say unintentional. The moment you have wrongly availed, what you have done, instead of taking a credit of CGST, SGST, which is in the state of Maharashtra, which does not get carried to state of Tamil Nadu, I have wrongly taken. That is example number 1. Example number 2. So I am doing an accounting entry. While accounting, I have to punch as 32,000. By mistake, I have punched as 3,20,000. Bill got accounted, input tax credit also got accumulated, or I have taken export from my ERP software, and while doing the mathematical calculation, somewhere by mistake 1 0 got added extra. The 32,000 has become 3,20,000. Wrongly availed, wrongly utilized. Then what it says, look, for any reason other than reason of fraud, intention, misstatement or suppression, your penalty shall be 10,000 or 10% of the tax due. It says 10,000 or 10% of the tax due. This is what is my penalty. Again, I repeat, when you look into this transaction, I'll say this transaction, there was an erroneous, wrong availment of input tax credit for a reason other than reason of fraud, willful misstatement, suppression of facts. Then penalty shall be either 10,000 or 10% of the tax due. Example, sir, instead of punching 32,000, I have punched as 3,20,000. Now I have taken an excess credit. What it says, either 10,000 or difference of 3,20,000 and 32,000. It comes to say 2,80,000. 10% of 2,80,000 is 28,000. 10,000 or 28,000, whichever is higher. So here penalty is 28,000. Now important factor is other than reason of fraud, willful misstatement, suppression of facts. There's one question, good question asked by one of your friend called Sridhar. Continuation to his question, continuation to what Sridhar has asked, my answer is here. Sir, if I say there is no intention to evade, there is no misrepresentation, there is no suppression of facts. Now here I have to prove to the department how I have written a letter to the concerned jurisdictional range office. Sir, I have filed my GST return for the month of August 2019. While filing my return, I have noted that instead of punching the input tax of 32,000, by mistake I have punched 3,20,000. This resulted in excess availment of 2,80,000. I am coming voluntarily to reverse that particular payment. Then your other than like your intention to fraud, willful misstatement, suppression of facts, everything goes off. I draw your attention here to section 23. The last session, what our other faculty has explained, please draw back to section 73. Section 73, subsection 5. Please write down your working note. 73, subsection 5, where I have established that there is no intention to evade payment of tax. Then my penalty gets limited to 10% of the tax due. It does not be higher than that particular amount. So wherever there is an intention not of a fraud, then my penalty is 10,000 or 10% of the tax due, whichever is higher. For reasons of fraud or willful statement, now this is a bucket number 2. You have an intention to evade payment of tax because of fraud, willful misstatement, suppression of facts, etc. My penalty shall be equivalent to 10,000 or tax due from such person or tax due from such person. Now here what is happening? My penalty is equivalent to the tax due. Now example 3,20,000, 32,000 we are saying. The mistake of 32,000 punched as 3,20,000, the gap is 2,80,000. Whenever there is an assessment scrutiny, in that section 122 subsection 2 has been invoked, where my intention to evade payment of tax is not established by any of the documentary evidence. Then clause 2 comes into picture, where my penalty is equivalent to the tax How much is the tax? 2,80,000. So I'm supposed to pay entire 2,80,000 as penalty. This is the offense, a serious offense under section 122. So friends, this is what we need to keep in mind when we are talking about our penal provisions. Let me see if there are any questions till now. There is a question from Sridhar. Sridhar, I hope I have answered your question with respect to fraud, willful misstatement. This question of Sridhar, how do we establish that this intention of fraud, error, misrepresentation does not exist? Friends, I would say it is only on the basis of a documentary evidence. If I can prove to the officer saying that I don't have intention to cheat, I don't have intention to fraud, I don't have a misrepresentation or suppression of facts. How? Only when I reveal, when I communicate to the officer, then this clause 1 comes into picture. My penalty is 10,000 rupees or 10% of the tax due under section 122 subsection 2. So this is what we need to understand from section 122 subsection 2. Now 122.3 is a beautiful section. When you qualify and when you get into the practice, where you come into drafting of laws, when you get into interpretation of statutes, where you excel your skill set in drafting legal interpretation. This is one provision, interesting provision we need to see. My section 122 says, 122.1 says where there is a taxable person. Section 122.3 says penalty leviable on any person. Now this is very, very interesting provision where one has to draw your attention to. When I say any person, it is not a taxable person. A person who is not registered, not liable to be registered, can also be fitting into this particular ambit. So when I say 122.3, this covers a penal provisions, penalty leviable on any person. Now we will see what is that they are talking about here. 122.3. Examination, one question I think you can expect from 122.3. A person who aids or abets any offences on 1 to 21. Now it says a person who has aided means who has supported or who abets, who encourages, aids or abets, directly or indirectly encouraging. Now I'll give an example. Institute Metal has given one simple example, very apt to this point. I'm an individual customer. I'll go to a electronic showroom. Now, electronic showroom, I'm asking, I'm interested to buy a television. Cost of television is 50,000. Shop owner says on television 50,000. GST is applicable at the rate of 18%. Say 9,000. 50,000 on that 9,000, 59,000 is the total cost of television. I again get into negotiation where I say I'll pay you 55,000. Then I'll say, look, I'll pay you cash of 50,000. Please don't charge GST. Now, what is happening here? The shop owner is supposed to collect GST being a registered person. I being a buyer, I'm encouraging the shop fellow to sell a TV without an invoice. Now he's giving a television without a tax invoice, without a GST. To save that 9,000, I'm saying that, look, I'll give you a cash of 50,000. I'll buy that goods without paying GST. Now here, are you not encouraging the shop fellow? Are you not directly encouraging the shop fellow for committing of any of the offences? Issues, supplies any goods without a tax invoice. 122.1.1. 122 subsection 1 clause 1. Supplies any goods without issuance of a tax invoice. Are you not engaged in aiding or abetting? Here, abet is your encouragement. You are encouraging a shop fellow to sell a television. That is where section 123 comes and says, the moment you encourage someone to commit this particular fraudulent activity, you will be covered under penal provisions. You will be covered under criminal provisions. This is what we need to understand. Coming back. 122.3 clause A. Acquires possession of or in any way concerns himself in transporting, removing, depositing, keeping, concealing. All this is in relation to goods which are liable for confiscation. So always there is a culpable state where there are parties who support for a transaction. Example, granite. There is a granite movement happening in a lorry or a truck where the lorry fellow knows that this granite is being moved unofficially without any valid documents. He knows if I go through this particular road, there is a check post, there will be a fellow who will catch. I'll use another alternate road so that I can avoid check post. Now all those people who is acquiring, who is having a possession, who is concerned himself in transporting, removing, depositing, keeping, concealing, etc., which he has a reason to believe that these goods are liable for confiscation. So if you are a party to that transaction as a transporter, you will also be held responsible under 122(3). Next, receives any goods with the supply of any, deals with supply of services. Now, point number C is a theoretical provision. Practically, I don't see that possibility to invoke, where they say if you have received a services which you have a reason to believe that those services are in contravention of the GST law, then you being a recipient, you will be held responsible or committing an offence. Fails to appear before the officer of central tax. Now, when issued with a summons, now summons are issued, it is not compulsory that only a registered person should be appearing. A person who is not registered can also be summoned. Example, when I look into transactions of a particular registered person, I see that there is a transporter. I see that there is a fellow supplying drinking water. That fellow is a transporter come supplying of a drinking water. Transportation business he has built to the extent of 24 lakhs. Transportation covered under reverse charge mechanism, no need to get registered. In addition to transportation, he also supplies drinking water. Value of drinking water is say 8 lakhs. Both put together, though assuming threshold limit is 20 lakhs, it has exceeded the threshold limit. He is supposed to get registered but not registered. Summons can be issued to that fellow to appear before a central tax officer. Fails to issue invoice in accordance with the provisions of this act. A person who is supposed to issue an invoice in provisions of this act but not issued, or fails to account an invoice. Now, this fails to account an invoice is little important to understand how he has done an e-way bill reconciliation. He has come for inspection. There are goods which are lying in your shop floor. These goods are not accounted. Means there is a list of goods as per your inventory register. There are physical goods available. When I do a physical comparison, physically I have 120 units. In my ERP stock register, I have only 70 units. So there is a gap of 50 units where there is no reasonable explanation, or there is an invoice which is not accounted in my books of accounts. Then the officer can invoke my penal provisions under this particular provision. If any of these provisions are made, he shall be liable to a penalty which may extend up to 25,000 rupees. So 122(3) says that any of those persons identified above, there is a penal provision applicable which may extend up to 25,000. So here the law has given a maximum ceiling of 25,000. 25,000 CGST law, 25,000 SGST law. So a penalty of 50,000. It says may. The moment term used is may. So can 10,000 be levied as a penalty? Can 5,000 be levied as a penalty? Can 15,000 be levied as a penalty? Discretionary power. This is something which comes into your argument whenever there is a commitment of an offense. So this is one thing which we have to keep in mind with respect to section 122 subsection 3. Friends, please open the Excel file. There are a couple of problems set in the backdrop of section 122 where we will discuss before we go to another provision. Open your let me just check. Yeah, before we go to section 123 122, there is a couple of questions set in your Excel file. I recommend all of you open your Excel file. We will discuss this Excel couple of problems and we'll come back. Meanwhile, there are a couple of questions. J. Srivastava, will both penalty under 73, 74 and 122 will be levied simultaneously? J. Srivastava from Delhi is asking this question. J, to answer your question, I draw your attention to section 73 or 74, section 122. Please understand, this is a guiding provision. This is a determining provision. J, section 122 guides what should be the penalty, under what circumstances what penalty can be levied. So I, as an officer, when I have to levy a penalty under section 73 or section 74, I'll take the guidance under section 122. Then I'll determine my demand under section 73. If you recollect your provisions, what was discussed in the last class, this is all your demand and recovery provisions. Your section 73 and all, this is all your demand and recovery. So my demand and recovery happens under 73, 74. Now, how do I demand? How do I quantify? My 122 comes and clarifies that in this case of scenario, in this offense, this is my penalty. So I'll get an input from section 122 for quantifying the amount that I will demand by virtue of section 73, 74. So I wouldn't say they both are overlapping sections where levy under 73, my penal provision under 73, penal provision under 122, both does not come into picture. So I get a guidance from section 122 till 138. Based on these sections, I'll come to my demand and recovery provisions, what was discussed in the last class, and I'll recover something called penal provisions. Hope I have clarified your point, G. Friends, hope you have opened this Excel file. Let me just take this and put it here. Yeah. There is one slide, first sheet called modalities of presentation in your examination. Theory questions, again, style and fashion of answering giving the answers is independent to every individual, independent to every faculty. But better way of presentation in your examination, especially the theory questions, I would recommend to go this way. Have your answer presented in 4 parts. First part, I call that as part A, which deals with your facts of the given case. Whatever problem is there, you try to explain the provision in a simple language. Don't write entire question as it is in your part A. Take the relevant facts like a registered person, like a person or C. I'll say Mr. X, a registered person. Then I'll say registered in state of Tamil Nadu. So I'll try to take only the given information in my facts of the case for solving my problem. I'll not copy entire provision as it is. Only the relevant information, I call that as a facts of the given case. Then part B, relevant provisions as per the GST law. What I will do, I'll explain my relevant provisions, whatever concept is there as per GST law, I'll try to put it in part B. Now, many faculty have confirmed this. Again, I'm confirming. When you're quoting your relevant provisions of GST law, it is not hard and fast rule that you have to quote section, subsection, or a rule number. If you quote as per the provisions of GST law, absolutely good enough to that level. If you add a section number, it gives an additional value add to your answer. Part C. What I will do, I'll apply the relevant provisions to my given facts of the case, and I'll try to analyze the given scenario. I'll try to apply these two and do the analysis in my part number C called analysis of the relevant provisions. Finally, in part D, I'll call that as a conclusion. So this is my presentation. How I do in my examination. Now, come to sheet number A called part A. I'll increase the size. Hope this Excel file is visible to you at this size. Jay Srivastava, hope I have clarified your doubt. Yes. Now, coming to your slide number, problem number A. This problem number A, it talks about your from the audit conducted Mrs. ABC Limited, a registered person, section 122, taxable person, registered, liable to be registered. I'm covered here. In the state of Gujarat, audit party has found following observations for the period April to March. Examine the penal applicability under GST law. Now, we need to understand each and everything. Bucket 1, 2, 3, 4 and penalty. Should I apply under 122.1? Should I apply under 122.2? This is what I have set in the backdrop. Supplies goods for 2,85,000 during April on sale or approval basis as on 31st March. Either goods have been received back, neither. It should be written as neither. Neither goods have been received back nor any tax invoice has been issued in this regard. Now, this point comes with respect to section 31 where I supply the goods on a sale or approval basis where 6 months is the time limit given. Now, I have supplied the goods in the month of April. Till March, the goods were not received back nor a tax invoice was issued. This comes into bucket number 4. Supplies goods where tax is not paid. Non-payment of taxes, bucket number 4. In bucket number 4, again, when you come to section 122.2, I have to pay my penalty under section 122.2 where 10K or tax because intention to evade payment of tax. If that is not, if that exists, I'll pay 10,000 or tax, whichever is higher. If intention to evade payment of tax does not exist, then I'll pay 10,000 or 10% of tax, which 10% of tax not paid, whichever is higher, where intention to evade payment of tax does not exist. So answer to point number 1, it is covered under section 122 clause 2. Next, tax invoice has been issued for 38,000 to a local customer on 20th March. However, due to internal communication gap, goods were not dispatched till date of audit. Now here, what happened? I have raised a tax invoice. Some internal communication, I have not dispatched the goods. While filing my GST return, I have considered this as outward supply. Also, taxes were paid. Now here, I'll invoke my section 122. Section 122. 1, where I'll say 10,000 or tax evaded. Here, there is no tax evaded. So, my element of tax applicable for penalties, section 122, subsection 1, 10,000 is my penalty which is applicable for this particular transaction. Why? I have supplied the goods, I have raised a tax invoice without supplying up the goods. Is it an offense? Answer is yes, definitely it is an offense. Now, bucket 1, 2, 3, 4, procedural. I have raised a tax invoice without supplying goods. Again, intention to evade, etc. So there is a miscommunication internally, because of which the goods are lying over there. Now, officer will say it is falling under bucket 2. I have to establish that this is falling in bucket number 1, whereby 10,000 will be my tax penalty which is applicable. Scenario 3. A government contract has been executed for a composite value of 1 to 1 lakhs, all inclusive during May 20. Mrs. ABC Limited has discharged GST at 5%, inclusive basis of 57,000. Department officer noticed that actual rate is 18%. Now, this is a scenario where why there is a demand of 18%. He says there is a relevant certificate lower is missing. Relevant certificate is missing. As per the law, this is just a example taken for academic purpose. Assuming that there is a certificate to be obtained where my regular rate of tax from 18% comes to 5%. I have supplied the goods, but I have failed to collect that certificate. When I fail to collect that certificate, the differential tax of 13%, this comes into non-payment, bucket number 4. Bucket number 4, non-payment of tax. Again, section 122, 2 comes into picture. Where again, department officer will say you have an intention to evade payment of tax. You pay either 10,000 or tax, whichever is higher, for the differential amount. So answer here will be assuming 12 lakhs, 12, into 18 divided by 118. This is the tax which officer says you have to pay. Already I have paid a tax in my returns of 57,143. So officer will say you have short paid your tax to the extent of 57,000. So in my penal provisions, tax paid 1,25,000 is not paid. 10,000 or 1,25,000, whichever is higher, because this is higher, my penal provision under section 122 will be 1,25,000. Next, moving on to my transaction number 4. Input tax credit has been availed on 31st August for rupees 1,20,000 IGST. However, goods received at the site of the registered person only on 15th September. Input tax credit has been availed and not utilized till 30th September. Now here, I have availed the input tax credit prior to receipt of the goods. Now, was there any intention to evade, etc.? Now, section 122 2 comes into picture. Availment or utilization. Where you have availed the credit, though you have not utilized, by invoking my section 122.2, the tax amount or 10,000, whichever is higher, shall be invoked as a penal provision. Now, please understand, when we say, for a moment, if I assume that penalty gets confirmed, penalty of rupees 120 I have to pay. Now, I should have enough profit margin to withstand with this penalty of 1,20,000. I should have cash availability to withstand this penalty of 1,20,000. Assuming that there are 4-5 transactions like this, cumulative of that, what is the exposure which is on the company? So this is one important aspect we need to see, where we try to become a consultant to protect the interest of the company by examining all the GST provisions. As I was telling in the beginning of the class, when I read this penal provisions, entire GST law, I have glanced through by virtue of my section 122 till 128. If I can answer all those, I have done a fantastic job in terms of auditing the assessee for law compliance. Next, finally, goods worth 1,20,000 were sent on delivery chela on 30th April for a job worker to Mr. X, not registered. The moment I say job work is not registered, miscellaneous provisions where section 143 talks about your job work provisions. I have sent the goods on 30th April to a job worker. This job worker is not registered. This job worker is in the state of Gujarat, in the district called Ahmedabad. After the job work, goods were sold to a customer in Palanpur. So this gentleman who is there in the state of Gujarat, he sent the goods to a job worker whose value is 1,20,000. This job worker is in Ahmedabad. After the job work, the goods were sold to a customer who is there in Palanpur. Palanpur is a district in the state of Gujarat for a sum of rupees 1,50,000. So my value addition from 1,20,000 has gone to 1,50,000. No e-way bill has been issued since goods were not removed from the registered place of business, additional place of Mrs. ABC Limited. Now, here, is there a violation under GST law, section 122? Transport goods without having enough documents. 1. E-way bill is required for movement of goods having a value more than 50,000. Rule 138. This is the non-compliance as per Rule 138. Also, further, there is a procedural violation. What is that procedural violation? Section 22 read with section 143, where if I want to supply the goods from a job worker, I have to add my job work as an additional place of business. Refer to chapter dealing with registration read with section 143. I, being a principal, if I send the goods to a job worker, from job worker I am removing the goods. I have to ensure that my job work is registered under the GST law. If job work is not registered, I, being a principal, have to add that job worker as an additional place of business. Because of two non-compliances, the penalty is 10,000. Now, there is no tax evasion because it's a procedural non-compliance. So, there is a penalty to be payable to the extent of 10,000 under section 122(1). Again, all 21 I have put into 4 buckets. I am trying to understand those things in this fashion. So friends, answer to this particular question, I'll answer this fashion. Now, there is one provision. Now, I'll come to this little later. This is covering my section 122, subsection 1, where different provisions, how do I apply my this particular bucket 1, 2, 3, 4, how the quantification of the penalty gets happened, and how do we answer my problem in our examination. So till now, this is coverage of section 122. Hope section 122, everyone is clear till now what we have discussed. Let me see if there are any questions on section 122, subsection 1. Till now, section 122, what we have covered till now. Let me see the questions. Last question is from Jay Srivastav. He says is clear. So no more questions till now. I'll continue with our discussion. Now, section 123, which deals with your failure to furnish information written. Now, this is one provision which is dealing with your collection of information. Now, please, if you read the provisions, you'll understand how the tax officer is working. There was one question, let me recollect the name. Who's that? I think Sridhar. Sridhar is the person who has this question. Fraud or misstatement, owners to prove. Yes. There's one question from Sridhar. Connecting Sridhar's question, I'm explaining this provision. The tax officer, especially who's working in anti-evasion, They are the smart officers who work in the revenue department, anti-evasion. If you happen to do your civil services, get qualified as an IRS officer and get into the excise, indirect taxation or income tax department, this is one platform how you will think to get the data. First, let me read this para and I'll explain what it talks. If a person, the moment I say person, need not be a registered person. If a person who is required to furnish what information written under section 150, where he fails to do so within a specified period, within a specified in the notice issued under subsection 3 or thereof, the proper officer may direct that such person shall be liable to a penalty of 100 rupees for each day of the period during which such failure continues, provided that penalty imposed under this section shall not exceed a maximum of 5,000 rupees. So here, this particular provision talks about information written. This information written is called under section 150. I was talking about this particular thing. There is something called desk review. DESK, desk review. The way when we do our audit planning, go back to your auditing standards, when we do audit, planning of an audit, there are various things we try to collate. What is the nature of assessee business which we are going to do audit? What we will do, we will take the information of last year financials, we will take the information what we have obtained, there is statutory audit report of previous year, their income tax, advance tax payments, their nature of business, what is the production, what is the status of filing of returns. You will try to do a comparative analysis. This year, what is the P&L movement? Like, what is this increase, decrease? What is the current electricity consumption? What is your labor charges? What was your labor wages last year? What was the wages this year? You do all analytical analysis. That is what happens under section 150, where I, being a officer, person in charge or proper officer, I'm talking about a proper officer from the officer point of view. I, being a proper officer, I'll call for information from where, from a person, from where, from a person. That person who is required to give information. Now, if that fellow, who is that fellow? I'll explain little bit later. So if I have called for information which consists of details of a particular registered person, I'll do a desk review before even visiting the premises of an assessee. I'll see how much was the electricity consumed, how much was the LPG consumed, what was the labor charges incurred, what was the input tax credit taken on raw material, what was the quantum of import of goods. I'll draw the information from my IceGate portal. I'll see how many consignments were cleared. This person has got IEC code. Is he having only one place or multiple places? All this is a statistical information I am collecting under what? Under section 150. So when you look into section 150, the list of persons, I'm just giving a indicative list, not the exhaustive list. It could be a taxable person, means calling information from any other taxable person. When I'm doing assessee of audit of one person, I'll call from a competitor, I'll call from a supplier, I'll call information from a customer. All the data from a taxable person or any authority of a state government who is responsible to collect under VAT, sales tax, state excise or central excise. Authority of the central government who collects taxes under central excise or customs. State electricity board, registrar or sub-register. Property. I'll get to know whether there was a purchase and sale of a property, when was the construction activity happened. Now all this is the information where the statistical data under section 150 is called for under section 123. Why do I do that? I try to get the information before I conduct an audit. If I fail to get from any of these persons, the list what you're seeing here, I, being a proper officer, I've called for information and any of these officers fail to provide that information, from the day the notice what it indicates, 100 rupees per day under CGST, 100 rupees under SGST. Maximum of 5,000, because all these people are not duty bound, but GST has casted a responsibility on these officers to provide that particular information, which is called as your information written. This is my penalty under section 123. Next, failure to furnish statistics. Now this is covered under section 124, where a person required to furnish any information. Now, this section 124 has been set in the backdrop where commissioner takes the information before he decides to issue any notification, before he takes any decision for the purpose of audit or any other matters concerned. He draws information for statistical data. What is required in this particular industry? What is the retention ratio? What is the turnaround ratio? In this particular manufacturing sector, what is my standard loss? What is my wastage? What is my byproduct? In this particular industry, what is the electricity consumption pattern? I try to get something called statistical information. So here, if any person required to furnish an information under 151, section 150, information written, 151, statistical data, required to furnish under that section, willfully furnishes or furnishes any information or written which he knows to be false. There was an information which is given wrong, or he has not given that information. Then he says that there is a penalty extended to rupees of 10,000 in case of a continuing offence, and further 100 rupees per day, maximum of 25,000. This is just an ancillary provision where if I have to get the information, the end user has failed to furnish the information, then there is a penalty of 10,000 rupees, like 100 rupees per day. I can levy a penalty up to 10,000. In spite of levying a penalty of 10,000, still I don't get the relevant information. 100 rupees per day, I can go maximum up to a sum of rupees 25,000. Here, I'm not confiscating any goods. I'm not penalizing. I'm not putting anyone behind bars. For me to take a decision as a commissioner, enabling my decision making, I am calling for information. That is covered under my section 124. Now, this section 151 talks. Commissioner, if he is considering that it is necessary to do by virtue of a notification, he shall direct to call the statistics. Now, this is covered under my section 151. If the person is failing to respond, then a penalty under section 124 can be levied, which can go maximum up to rupees 25,000. So friends, this is my section 124 read with my section 151. Section 125 deals with your general penalty. Now, this, as I was telling, general penalty this is one ancillary provision. This is one ancillary provision where I don't get an answer anything under section 122, or I don't get any answer under 122. 1, 2, 3. There are 3 subsections under 122. It is not possible for the lawmaker to anticipate, visualize all the sort of fraud, offences, etc. That's why this ancillary provision will be there in any law, which is called general penalty. What it says, any person who contravenes any of the provisions of this act. The term any person they have referred. They have not referred to a taxable person. Any person who contravenes the provisions of this act or any rules made thereunder. Any provisions of the act or any rules made thereunder for which no penalty is separately provided. I have not quantified a penalty for that particular offence in this act shall be liable to a penalty which may extend up to 25,000 rupees. Here there is only a maximum ceiling provided, and can there be a discretionary power? Answer is yes, it could be a discretionary power. For any small offences, if an officer is recovering a demand of 25,000, 50,000, that can be appealed against, where we will see in the next session what is an appeal. Being a discretionary power, because the law says which may extend up to 25,000. The term may used shall, it is not shall, it is may. So it is indicated that it is a discretionary power to alert the assessee that you don't commit this kind of offence again and again. So the officer can have a discretionary power to levy a penalty. Now generally what will happen, a person who is issuing a show cause notice, who generally happens to be a superintendent or assistant commissioner or a deputy commissioner, this person issues a penalty of 50,000. I plead in my ignorance and say, sir, you are penalizing to the core because it is a discretionary power. I request you to reduce the penalty. Commissioner may have a call when I go for an appeal saying that, okay, I'll reduce from 50,000 to a nominal fee of 5,000. This is what happens generally in the practical course with respect to section 125. So keep in mind, I don't have any of the situation which is examined, which is explored under section 122, then I come and fit in 125, where a general penalty of 25,000 can be levied. Can a non-registered person be penalized under the GST law? Here they say they refer to any person who contravenes any provisions of this act. I refer to your attention of this section 35. I was talking about an example called books of accounts to be maintained by a warehouse operator. Sir, I am a warehouse operator. I am not registered under GST law. I am not registered. So should I need to maintain books of accounts? If I fail to maintain books of accounts, section 125 comes into play, saying that any person, registered operator, registered warehouse operator, section 35 clearly gives. I recommend all of you to write down these sections and the content coverage. Why we refer to section? It is easy for us to name what is covered in that section. With that backdrop, we refer to section numbers. So please write down those sections so that you get memorized in the process of our discussion. Section 35 deals with your accounts and books of accounts, accounts records and books of accounts. When a warehouse operator or a godown owner, he has failed to maintain books of accounts for what? Details of consignor, details of consignee, where goods are stored in a warehouse, then I can fall under section 125, where it says any person. So I, being a non-registered person, very well can get covered under 125 for the purpose of levy of penalty. This is what we have discussed under section 35. Before I go further, let me see if there are any questions till now. There's one question from J. Srivastav saying that, is there any difference between information written and the statistics? Definitely yes, J. Srivastav. See, information written is detailed information which is called for. In statistical report, it is just a consumption. Like what I will do, take example of KEB, what you call electricity board. In case of an electricity board, J. Srivastav, I'll give you the statistics industry specific. For a service sector, for an entity which is registered as a service sector, please give me the consumption of units. Please give me the consumption of units during the peak hour, during non-peak hour. Please give me the consumption of power in detail month on month for a particular person. When I call for a particular assessee, I call that as a information report. When I call for a business in general, I call that as a statistics. So when I call in general, I call that as a statistics. When I call in specific for a person, for a particular determined period, I call that as a information report. So section 150, 151, this is the large difference, J. Srivastav. Hope I have clarified your point, J. There's next question from Ambika. In case of section 123, I think question is incomplete, Ambika. You said in case of 123, please complete your question so that I can answer back your question. So I'll continue with my discussion on section 125. That is general penalty, section 125. Coming to next provision called section 126, general disciplines related to penalty. Very, very important to go through this particular section 126. General disciplines. So whenever there's a invoking of penal provisions, this is what we need to keep in mind. This is what we need to keep in mind. How an officer draws this, concludes that a penalty can be invoked under this particular provision called 126. No office. I think there are a couple of questions. I'll take those questions and I'll come back to 126. Otherwise, we'll be in mid of the discussion. Let me see the questions. Ambika says 123. Ambika, if you clarify your question, complete your question, I can clarify. Gigi Jose has one question. Under section 35, manufacturing entities are required to maintain stock of goods like receipt, lost and destroyed, closing balance, etc. separately, or raw material, finished goods, scrap. How GST officer get in to know whether entity maintains this if he correctly furnished or paid taxes? Gigi has a question from Kerala. Sir, how does a tax officer gets to know in case of a manufacturing entity? where whether the manufacturing entity has maintained the stock of returns or goods under section 35, where raw material, finished goods, work in progress, whether I have maintained, especially with respect to scrap, etc. How does the officer get to know? So answer to your question, Gigi, it so happens that whenever there is a departmental assessment, uh, most of the time, 95% of the time, the officer, especially in case of manufacturing or trading, officer visits to the registered premises. When he visits to the registered premises, first and foremost he says, look, I want to have a verification of your premises. He'll walk through your premises. When he does the walkthrough of premises, he'll call for verification of stock. I need a printout of your stock register. The moment I get a printout, I physically verify this with that. Next, he will say, get me the stock statement as of previous month, means closing stock statement. Section 35, I am supposed to. Section 35, read with Rule 56. I repeat, Section 35, read with Rule 56. I am supposed to maintain my books of accounts on a monthly basis. So when I combinedly read, I have a onus to maintain my books of accounts on a monthly basis, where I update my stock records on a monthly basis. I get to know what is my closing stock. I get to know what is my, from closing stock, I'll get to know what is my stock purchases, what is my stock produced and this sold. I'll try to correlate all the information using my analytical skills. So answer to your question, Gigi, when the officer tries to do an analytical analysis, what is your opening stock of raw material, purchases, what is addition of raw material, consumption, issued to production, left out in your stock as per books, left out physically available. I'll compare. So this happens when there is a physical audit of a assessee. So it happens only during a case of physical inspection of a premises. Hope I've answered your question, Gigi. There's one question from Ambika. In case of section 123, I hope you are asking for written and statistics, Ambika. If in case of section 123, which talks about penalty for failure to furnish information written, wherever the information was called from a particular person, if that person has defaulted in giving the data, then penalty can be levied up to a maximum of rupees 5,000. Information written called for 123. Statistical data called for 124. Again, both are required for desk review of the proper officer concerned. Coming to section 126, general disciplines. No officer under this act shall impose a penalty for minor breaches of tax. Fantastic provision. It says, no officer shall impose, language used, shall impose. I cannot impose a penalty for what? Minor breach. Sir, what is minor breach? We'll understand later. Minor breach of tax regulation or procedural requirements. This indicates bucket number 1. When we read section 122, 1, 2, 3, 4, 4 buckets. My bucket number 1 called minor breach, procedural lapses. No penalty for minor breach of regulations or procedural requirements, and in particular, any omission or mistake in documentation which is easily rectifiable, So they say, when I look into my procedural aspects, document, tax invoice, I say there was a false invoice issue. Instead of like 10 goods were supplied, by mistake I have mentioned quantity column 1. Sir, I am writing the invoice by hand. Instead of writing 10, I have written as 01. Clerical error, human error. Instead of writing 10, by oversight I have written 01. Per unit 5,000, right? 5,000 into 10, 50,000. So under unit column, 5,000 is printed. Quantity column, instead of 01 is printed, written. Under amount column, 5 into 10, 50,000. 50,000 was written. Sir, it is a rectifiable error. Was there intention to conduct fraud? No, it is not intention. So it says, any mistakes done which are minor, any mistakes which are easily rectifiable, which are made, how? Without fraud. I made an error. I committed a procedural lacuna without a fraudulent intent, or it is a gross negligence in the case of this handwritten invoice. When I look into invoice, unit rate 5,000, quantity column 01, value column 50,000. How can 5,000 into 1 quantity can be 50,000? It is an indication that it's a procedural lacuna. Those cases they say my offences I cannot levy an offence under section 126. Further it says explanation. What is your minor breach? My minor breach will be the amount where tax involved is less than 5,000 rupees. If the tax amount involved is less than 5,000 rupees, it should be called as a minor breach. Further, any omission or any mistake in a documentation shall be considered easily rectifiable if the same is error apparent on the face of the record. So in the example what we have discussed, my error 01 instead of 10 is an error. It is a false invoice. I admit, sir, I have no intention. Reason 5,000 into 10 only it becomes 50,000. 5,000 into 1 should become 5,000. But I have shown 50,000. I have collected tax of 50,000. Section 126 overrides. Section 126 overrides my section 122 saying that no penalty shall be imposable under section 126. Let me see if there are any questions quickly. J. Srivastava says it has been clarified. Ambika have clarified. Yes, ma'am. So far no other questions are there. Let me come back to our discussion. Further, section 126 says, subsection 2. Penalty imposed under this act shall depend on the facts and circumstances of each case. Friends, understand this language very, very clearly. It says facts and circumstances. Each case. When the audit is done, there are 3 arithmetical errors. There are 3 cases where input tax credit was wrongly availed. Now each case, please understand the language. My penalty will depend how fact and circumstance of each case. I cannot bluntly compare these 3 things together. How 3 cases there was a wrong availment of input tax credit. Case number 1. My bill says 18,000. I have punched as 1,80,000. I repeat, my bill says 18,000. I have punched as 1,80,000. Is that a gross negligence? Probably gross negligence. Second transaction, my bill says 28,000. I have accounted as 82,000. Key manual, when I am entering by hand, 28,000 was accounted as 82,000. Third scenario, bill says a credit of 1,50,000. I have availed a credit of 2 lakhs. Bill says 1,50,000. I have accounted 2 lakhs. Now, all the 3, I cannot club together as an officer and say, look, you have an intention to evade the payment of tax. Now, there, the assessee comes forward and says, sir, first case, instead of punching 30,000, I have punched 3 lakhs. Now, question comes here. While making the payment to the supplier, did I pay the tax of 30,000? Did I pay to the supplier 3 lakhs? So, by mistake, I have accounted 3 lakhs and I have paid 3 lakhs to my supplier. Can you say, is that an intent to evade payment of tax? Answer to one of our friend, I think Sridhar or Rahul, this is the answer again to answer to your question. I have my books of accounts. Sir, I have accounted 3 lakhs in my input tax register. While making the payment to supplier, have you paid 30,000? Have you paid 3 lakhs? Sir, erroneously I paid 3 lakhs. Can you say it is an intent to evade payment of tax? No, sir, it is a clerical error. So this is how practically case to case, evidence to evidence, we go in depth to understand every transaction is unique in nature. I cannot club all the transactions to take a decision. 122.2 clearly says each facts of each case should be examined. Then no penalty shall be imposed on any person without giving an opportunity of being heard. Now it is a basic assumption of the land of law, opportunity of being heard, which is your natural justice. Without I give you an opportunity to hear, I cannot levy a penalty. Answer to J, one question J asked, sir, penalty under section 73-74, penalty under section 122. Answer to that J, I being an officer, I will go for 73-74 to determine the tax. First, I'll write a letter to the assessee. I'll write a love letter. This is a notice to you for so-and-so transactions. We have examined that you did so-and-so mistakes. Please explain why your mistake cannot be an offense under section 122 and recovery can be done under section 74. So he says, I'm going to section 122 to say that this is an offense. Once I establish that it is an offense, I'll come to section 74 for recovery. I'll make a demand notice by way of an order and I'll recover. So this is how the process happens, where a natural discipline, I have to give an opportunity of being heard. I'll give all my defenses to the opponent to put across before I go for my confirmation. This is one last point we will discuss and we will wind up for the day. Bear with me for 1 or 2 minutes. Officer under this act shall, by imposing penalty in an order, again answer to your section 73J and others who are listening to me. My demand and recovery happens only under section 73-74. What it says, while imposing penalty in an order under 73 or 74 for a breach of what? Any law, regulation, procedural requirement, I have to specify the nature of breach. I, being an officer, have to specify in detail what is that have violated, what is that have committed, the registered person has violated the law. Is it a violation of section? Is it a violation of a road? Is it a violation of a procedural aspect? These three things clearly should be written, referring to my opening comments. The moment you receive a notice, don't panic. Please see what is the officer talking about. This reference, go back to the original section. What does the section say? What elements are there? Did he cover all those elements in the notice? And the applicable law, regulation or procedure under which the amount of penalty for the breach has been specified. Now it says, go to the specific applicability of the law or the regulation and the or a procedure under which the amount of penalty or breach has been specified. So you should clearly see, have I committed any offense? Have I committed any offense? Wherein all these particular provisions are covered, where the officer has a liberty, where the officer has a understanding that I have committed a offense which can be levied to law. There is one question from J where he says whether penalty would be levied on monthly written basis or annual basis or invoice basis. Question from J is whether penalty can be levied transaction level or monthly transaction or annual. So answer would be, I consolidate all the transactions. Generally audit happens for a specific period depending on the nature of offense. Like monthly, it generally will not happen, J. I quantify all the offenses which have taken place. On the basis of quantification, I'll go to section 122. List of, like refer to example A, I'll quantify all those offenses. What is the penalty? I'll compare that with 10,000, whichever is higher, I quantify. Usually in ordinary course of business, there will be a notice given for a particular period, which is for a financial year. I do audit of a financial year and then I issue a demand recovery notice under section 73 or section 74. So friends, I'll take 1 minute before we wind up. I request, like we have our next session on 30th where we will discuss of this penal provisions, offenses, and then go for appeals. My humble request is go through the presentation in detail what I have given and also the Excel file which we have given as a practice work. This chapter 19 which deals with the offense and penalty, I would recommend read once before you come for the next class, at least a plain reading. Reason, it gives a value addition to your practical knowledge, not only for your examination, even for the purpose of your career. So friends, with this, I'll stop my discussion for today. We will meet again on 30th to continue with our discussion. See you all till then. Good night. Jay, are you there? Jay?